So welcome, everybody. We are going to open the thesis defense session of the doctoral candidate, Pablo Aragón. The title of his dissertation is Characterizing Online Participation in Civic Technologies. And this thesis has been registered and developed at the Department of Information and Communication Technologies of this university. The supervisors of the thesis are Dr. Vicens Gomez from this university and Dr. Andreas Kaltenbrunner from the Universitat. The members of the thesis committee are Dr. Robert West from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, Dr. Josep Perelló from the Universitat de Barcelona, and myself, Dr. Rosa Borge from the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya. So now is the turn of the candidate. He has 45 minutes, more or less, for presenting his thesis, and then we will have the round of questions that will take around 15 minutes. We will ask the questions and then you reply, and then if we have some reply to your questions, we can have a kind of dialogue, but we hope that it won't take more than 15 or 20 minutes each. So, I give the word to Pablo, and we can start with the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borge, for the introduction, and thank you all for attending the presentation of my PhD dissertation, Characterizing Online Participation in Civic Technologies. This is a work that is supervised by Dr. Vicens Gomez and Dr. Andreas Kaltenbrunner. And the work I'm presenting today is inspired by the notion of the platform society. We live surrounded by platforms, like we post and interact, posts on Facebook, posts on Twitter, videos on YouTube, photos on Instagram, and so on. So platforms have become central in the World Wide Web. Like the original idea of the web as a decentralized infrastructure of resources distributed all over the internet has been replaced by the relevance of platforms, have becoming more central in the activities we are doing online. At the same time, in recent years, we are witnessing the rise of civic technologies, which is a specific type of platforms, usually platforms, a specific type of information and communication technologies that are aimed at scaling up citizen participation and to promote new forms of democratic governance. When I'm talking about civic technologies as platforms, I can give examples like platforms for online petitions, for citizen debate, for participatory budgeting, accountability, and so on. However, as explained by Joseph and Dick and her colleagues in her recent book, The Platform Society, platforms are not only technological tools that allow users, and in the case of civic technologies, citizens, to do activities online. They also contain logics and logistics that shape behavior. They define the affordances, like how we can do activities online. So they say the way our activity can be produced, and they say how the platform society is organized. So this is the motivation of this dissertation. Civic technologies are intended to facilitate democratic participation online. As I presented before in the previous slide, platform design is not neutral. It conditions the way in which citizens participate online. And during this thesis, I've been collaborating with the development teams of different civic technologies that I will present during this, I will introduce during this presentation, that they were truly aware that every time that they were introducing or changing a platform feature, there was an awareness that it was going to have some political and social implication. But at the same time, it was seen that there was little empirical research examining the relationship between technical features in this domain, in civic technologies, and the way they affect in participation online and in participation online for democracy. So given that, the research goal of this dissertation, of this work over these 4 years, was to gain a deeper understanding on how interventions, like new features of the change of an existing feature in a civic technology, influence online participation. To do so, the methodology has been applied, had an initial constraint. Like it would involve to experiment with real participants in some of these platforms that are participating for the co-creation of public policies that they are going to affect their living conditions. So that might be ethically problematic. For that purpose, the approach of the methodology was to apply computational and statistical methods in for observational studies with open data that was already available and without the awareness and without the manipulation of the environment. So this is the non-invasive way of doing experimentation, the fourth type of human subject research proposed by Bowser and colleagues in 2015. So it implied that participants that were really co-creating public policies, they were not going to be interfere, and the environment was not going to be manipulated. And the 3 case studies of this dissertation are these 3 platforms that I will explain the details in every case study: Meneame, the city of Madrid, and the city of Barcelona. So the research in this dissertation is structured into 2 parts. First, I'm going to explain 2 case studies that analyze online discussions in Meneame, and then I will present 2 case studies of platforms with online petitions. Actually, the 4th case study will combine both of them. It will be a case study focusing on how to introduce online discussions in an online petition. So the first case study was motivated by this research question. Like, first, we wanted to check whether it was possible to detect automatically events that they were affecting deliberation in online discussions. So this is a work that was published in a journal in Policy and Internet, and before that journal version, it was presented in the IDP 2016 conference in Oxford, and it received the best paper award. So, why we were interested in focusing on online deliberation in online communities? Well, when the web became a global phenomenon, it was seen like the internet had the potential to create a new public sphere for political discussion, as proposed by Papa Cherici, but at the same time, further research is starting to be more skeptical and start to present some conclusions that internet per se was not going to lead necessarily to online deliberation. More recent studies have focused on which elements of discussions might facilitate deliberation or not. For instance, some studies, they have found like asynchronous discussions, like online forums as presented here, better promote deliberation than synchronous ways of communication like chats. And at the same time, more recent studies, they have focused on technical features of platforms, like whether moderation, the anonymity of users, or again, the synchrony of discussions might affect online deliberation by doing comparative studies among different platforms. So for this goal, for this research question, we focus on Meneame. For those who are not familiar with Meneame, Meneame is the most popular Spanish social news site. It's very similar to Reddit. Actually, the code is a fork of Dig. Maybe some of you remember what Dig was about. And it's not only a platform, it's an online community. It's a community of thousands of users who daily debate, discuss, and vote which news should appear in the front page, very similar to the Reddit or the Dig procedure. So we collected a data set with all the threads, all the news that appear in the front page of Meneame between 2011 and 2015, which were a data set with thousands of news and the corresponding discussion threads, in total more than 5 million. When we focus on Meneame, we are talking about civic technologies. Well, Meneame is inspired by Dig, it's very similar to Reddit. It's a social news site, but it became a major forum in Spain for political discussion. Actually, some studies, like the book done by José Candolmena about the 15th movement on the internet, it explained how Meneame it became a major online space, a public sphere that generated many of the claims of the movement. So although it was not conceived as a civic technology, finally it operated as civic technology for one of the major movements in Spain. This is a first exploration of our data set. Every dot is a day, and we can find that there is a very strong correlation among the number of stories, the number of posts per day, and the number of votes they collected. But there are some outliers here that we can see, like when the 50-man movement emerged, like it was overloaded by participation, by citizens who were discussing for the debate which were the claims of the movement. So it was working as a civic technology. This is relevant, but also there is a second aspect that makes Meneame of relevance for online deliberation, and is that conversation threading was adopted in 2015, January 2015. So this is the original interface of Meneame until that time. Like, this is the first post, the submission, the piece of news, and then any user can post a comment as a reply to the initial post or as a reply to a comment. So there was always a thread structure, an implicit thread structure. But what happened here is, like in 2015, in January 2015, they decided to make that thread structure explicit. So here we can see perfectly the hierarchical distribution of comments. So we can see perfectly how the thread is distributed. And this is relevant. This is relevant because previous work with experimental tools and with recruited participants, mostly chats, they have found some benefits of applying conversation threading. Like, for instance, there are studies that say that conversation threading provides better local context, or also it favors the mitigation of the context loss problem. This is the problem that users suffer when they are not able to identify who is replying to whom. And in some studies about thread discussions for online environments, they found that this thread discussion, like the one in Meneame, they facilitate the construction of knowledge among the students. So there were some benefits. And actually, the two interfaces I presented before, the two discussion threads with the linear and the non-linear, with no conversation thread, with conversation thread, this is the structure of the threads. We explore some typical discussion threads before and after the intervention, and what we found, this is the typical structure. Like, most of the replies, most of the comments are replies directly to the post, and sometimes there are long chains, some chains. And actually, the color here quotes authorship, so we can see that chains are alternating colors. So those are users who reciprocate messages. At the same time, this is a typical structure when conversation thread was applied. So here we can see that some discussion information cascades emerge at much deeper levels of the discussion. So at some point, some comments might trigger this discussion. It has a much more complex structure, a much more rhizomatic structure. And again, there are these long chains of two colors of users who are reciprocating each other. So the structure of a discussion thread is relevant because there has been some approaches, like the one by Sandra González-Bailón and colleagues, that say that there are some conditions that are not sufficient but necessary for online deliberation, which is representation and argumentation. So we focus on the structure of a thread. Representation means that it's a very wide structure, like there are many users participating. While argumentation to occur, we have to see these levels of depth, like users are exchanging ideas and they are having argumentation. So the goal for having deliberative structures will be associated with this kind of topologies, a much more complex, much more rhizomatic one. And how we can measure that? Well, we can apply the H index. The H index of a discussion thread is the maximal H level that has at least H comments. So here the third level has more than 3 comments, but the fourth level has less than 4 comments. So here H index equals 3. So we have a metric for measuring deliberative structures of discussion threads, and then we wanted to check, first to identify possible interventions, and then to measure the effect. So for doing so, we have been applying regression discontinuity design. Regression discontinuity design is a technique from econometrics that is based, is used in natural experiments. So we have two covariates, and in one of the covariates we define the control group and the experimental group. We are going to use time here as is this dimension, and then we have to see the effect in the other dimension. In this case, we are going to apply the H index. So the idea is like giving an intervention, we have to measure the break at the threshold. Obviously, a discontinuity is going to better fit, or at least it's going to fit data as good as the continuous one. And in this case, we're using the linear version. So what we did, like instead of having a given intervention and measure the effect, we are going to apply a statistical F-test to check in every possible time step, which is the one that gives the higher F statistic that implies that it's more likely to be the intervention creating a break at the threshold. We did that, and this is, we can see here, the maximum, the global maximum of the F statistic is precisely when conversation threading was applied. When conversation threading was applied, we can see here this discontinuity. Actually, we can see some other local optima, like this one here, and when we apply the same technique, not in the H index, but in the depth of the discussions, what we find is this other value for the F statistic, for the depth. And we find some event that we didn't know a priori. So we examined the GitHub repository of NAME, since it's free open source, and what we found this was the exact time when there was an intervention by the owner of the platforms that they increased the visual depth of the discussion. So by using this technique, we were not only able to measure a given intervention, but also to approximate when an intervention occurred. So this was our first goal. So now that we know how to detect interventions and we have found a very relevant intervention in MediaMed that affected deliberation, it was the deployment of conversation threading, we start to explore what are the other effects of conversation threading for discussion threads. So first we wanted to examine how does conversation threading affect reciprocity within the discussion of an online community. Then we are going to try to explore whether reciprocity is a key behavioral feature explaining the structure and growth of threads, of discussion threads. And finally, whether conversation threading affected behavioral features, like not only deliberation, but also reciprocity and other features that relates to user behavior. This is a work that was presented in and published in the proceedings on the ICWSM conference in 2017. So before I was talking about online deliberation, here I'm focusing on another dimension, which is reciprocity. It's relevant to focus on reciprocity, and it connects to online deliberation because it's a basic feature to consider deliberation in a discussion, like have some level of reciprocity. And not only that, like also reciprocity, like online communities are often defined by members who reciprocate. Reciprocity is a behavioral indicator of the emergence of a community. The absence of reciprocity leads community to fail. Actually, reciprocity, specifically in communication practices, it has been seen like a sign of inward focus and vigorous debate, and also an indicator of engagement in the discussions. So we apply the same technique. I'm not going to explain the details because it's exactly to the previous one, but instead of using H index, we are using reciprocity. Actually, we are using 3 metrics of reciprocity. Like for every discussion thread, we build the corresponding network of users connected by replies, and we apply the standard reciprocity. We apply the corrected one, applying the density of the network, and also since this network is weighted, we apply a metric for weighted networks. But in the 3 of them are very similar. Actually, they are sparse networks, so we can find at the same time, again, that the moment that conversation threading was applied, it was the moment that we find the higher F value and this discontinuity. This effect. We have measured first like the effect in terms of reciprocity, but we are not only interested in measuring the effect, but also to give a deeper understanding. So for giving a deeper understanding of the dynamics of online discussion threads, there are some techniques called generative models of discussion threads. The moment this work was done, there were different approaches, like the one by Kumar and colleagues in 2010, by Wang and colleagues in 2010, 2012, and the one by Gomez and colleagues in 2013 with different kind of networks. And they typically include some behavioral features, and they try to estimate the relevance of those features, to reproduce them in synthetic threads, and finally to validate whether the synthetic threads are structurally comparable to the original ones. What we found is like the existing models at that time, most of them, they fail to reproduce the deep structures of discussion threads. So this is a typical thread of many analysts. It's the same I presented before. So you can see here that depth, which is the maximal depth, is characterized by these long chains. And these long chains of alternating colors is because of this reciprocal behavior of users when discussing. So I'm saying something and the other person replies to me, etc., until someone gets bored. So this is relevant because this is it seems to be a very relevant behavior of discussion, but none of the models introduce reciprocity as an explicit feature when defining the model. So we took one of the models, the one by Gomez and colleagues in 2013, that is based on taking a discussion thread at any moment. So at every time stem, the thread is coded by the vector of parent nodes, and every time a new comment is arriving, there is an attractive next function that is a linear combination of three features. The first feature with the parameter alpha is popularity, so it's the preferential attachment process. So like popular comments with many replies are going to be more attractive. There is also the novelty, like it's exponential time decay, and with the parameter tau, so this feature what displaying is like all comments gradually become less attractive, while new comments are more attractive because they're about new information. And also there is a third feature, which is the root bias with the beta parameter, which is a distinction between being a reply to the initial post or to any other comment, because those are messages of different nature. So this is an example of how to generate models with different values. This is the null model, so there is not preference for any specific node when a new comment arrives. But here we have higher value of alpha, so the preferential attachment process is playing a role here. So some comments are much more attractive than the others, and the distribution, the degree distribution will be more unequal. Here the root bias is much higher, the beta parameter, so it's much more attractive. So many comments go directly to the post. And here we decrease tau, so the time decay factor is affected, and the most recent comment is almost always the one that is receiving the next reply. So it's like having almost synchronous discussion. So we took this existing model from 2013, and we did an extension. Like that model originally has one evolving process, while here it has two co-evolving processes. First, we add an author model based on preferential attachment. So every time that a new comment was arriving, we had to decide whether it was a new user given by data or doing preferential attachment given by how many replies that user has. So a user who has many replies is more likely to make a new comment to reply to them back. Once we have at every discrete time stem who is the author of the arriving comment, we extended the attractiveness function by adding reciprocity with the kappa parameter. So whether that author is going to reply to someone who has replied to them in the past. So it's going to create a reciprocal interaction, like actually whether the node, the grandparent of the node is going to be authored by the same user. So we evaluate this extension, and what we found is like we were able to fit data similarly as done in the original model, but the big advantage was when we compare in terms of depth. We can see here, and particularly here, by adding reciprocity, we are better to estimate and to reproduce discussion threads that are similar in terms of depth than the original data that we had from Maeztu. Actually, since we have now this model, we can apply regression discontinuity design in every subset of motley threads, and we can find here is like popularity. It was affected, like now popular comments are even more popular, or also there is this increase in the novelty decay, so now all comments retain more attention than they used to retain in the past, or also reciprocity increases, like this is consistent with the presented before, not out of the model, instead of the model, again reciprocity increases by adding this conversation thread at that point. Okay, so for the moment, we have seen how to detect events in terms of discussions, and we found the effects of conversation threading in terms of deliberation, also to detect other events that affected the depth of the destructors. And this depth of the destructor, we were able to explain it by reciprocity and formally using an extended generative model of discussion thread. So this is the first part of online discussions, and then we slightly move to the other paradigm analyzing this dissertation. This is platforms for online petitions. And the first case study in this part, the third case study in total, aims to find which are the platform features that might difficult the silent growth of online petition. And this is a work that is actually presented as a working paper and in a review process soon. So the motivation for doing this and focusing now on online petition platforms is like this is a paradigm of participation and a type of city technology that has received a lot of attention, or increasing attention in recent years. Mostly like in platforms like the one from the German Parliament, from the UK government, from the United States, but mostly to characterize the growth and particularly to just predict the final number of signatures of petitions, giving features of the petition, like the topic of the petition, some linguistic patterns, things related to the author. But few works have examined whether the platform feature, like the role of algorithms, might play a role, might affect and difficult why these petitions are growing or not. So for examining this, the idea was to, well, or the case study, focus on the Cide Madrid. The Cide Madrid is a platform that was launched in 2015 in Madrid by the City Council for hosting different processes of direct democracy. Like this is the front page, this is a screenshot from 2016, and here you can access to participatory budgeting, a voting process about a main square in Madrid. But one of the most relevant processes that started in the very early beginning of the platform until now is called citizen proposals, propuestas ciudadanas. So this is a process that is based in online petitions that any user can post a petition in the platform, and over a year, that petition needs to receive more than 27,000 signatures to be taken into consideration. I should say that only verified users, like users that provide their data to verify that they are residents of Madrid, can sign the petitions, and they need to reach that threshold in 1 year. Otherwise, the petition expires. So we collected all the existing petitions from the beginning of the platform until the end of 2017, with thousands of petitions and millions of signatures. And we should say that only 2 petitions reached that threshold. So we found this was a key relevant case study to examine why petitions were not growing to the expectation, to the expected value by the City Council. So here, if we press in Propuestas Ciudadanas, here or here, this is the homepage of Propuestas Ciudadanas, citizen proposals, and the homepage is ranking based. It's a paginated list of 25 petitions per page, and they are sorted by different criteria. The default, and I say the default because every time you enter into the Cide Madrid, this is the default criteria, is the hottest score. It's the hottest score inspired by Reddit. So it's showing petitions that are trending, so they are recent and popular, but recency plays a strong role for being hot. And also there are 2 alternative rankings, which are the most popular ones and the newer ones, by number of signatures or by date. And they also apply some interventions, so at some moment they set a banner for a few months with the 3 most popular petitions in total, but that banner was always visible, and then they changed the banner for only 2 petitions, which is this exact moment. So here the 2 most popular petitions were visible for almost a year. And actually these are the 2 ones that reached the threshold. As I said before, this platform contains this process for online petitions, citizen proposals, but it has some other processes in parallel. Like for instance, there are different editions of participatory budgeting with phases for submission, prioritization, and final voting of the proposals. There are also some voting processes, and also there were some campaigns that were asking, promoting the platform, some trying to bring users to the platform. And this is relevant, because some users will be attracted by specific petitions of the City of Madrid, like people who post a petition, they might share it with their colleagues to sign. But when this process happens, it's expected that some users are going to arrive with not a specific purpose to sign up a specific petition, which are similar to the aimless surfers proposed by Rosa Borges and colleagues in 2011. So it might be relevant, since they are not having any expected petition to sign, we have the hypothesis that are going to be affected by the default criteria, by the petitions that are exposed at a specific time. So we examine the data, and what we found is that, like when there are participatory budgeting, the yellow one, or there are campaigns, the green ones, or there are voting processes, the purple ones, there are these peaks of activity. So when there are other processes co-occurring in the Cine Madrid, the citizen proposals process present peaks of activity. So we wanted not to see that obviously there was going to be this unequal distribution of activity over time, but to examine which were the petitions that were receiving that attention. So here we have a scatter plot, so here we have the temporal dimension. So in this scatter plot, it expresses how many petitions, and I'm using color and size for expressing the number, are targeting, how many signatures are targeting petitions that have 0 days, are 0 days old, 10 days old, 1 day old, until 1 year, because after one year they expire. So as you can see here, when there is a peak of activity like this one, or like this one, or like these ones, there is this vertical line, but it mostly focuses on the bottom. So most of the signatures are done to the recent petitions, which is consistent with the default criteria. Like, since the hot score is promoting the trending ones, but by definition, the new ones are receiving much more attention. Actually, we can see these vertical lines. So petitions that are posted on a day with massive attention, they get a lot of signatures. It's expected that they are going to receive a major number of signatures. They become some of them become among the most popular ones, and because they are in the second ranking, they are able to grow over time. Otherwise, if you are publishing one of these days that there is no major activity at the beginning, when you are visible by default, you disappear. And this is even more relevant here. This is an outlier. We examined why that was happening, and what we found is like most of this signing activity focus on specific petitions of a civic organization. They made a campaign for collecting signatures, so they collected a lot of signatures of a petition that were published like some months ago, but then they didn't continue growing because they didn't reach the second global ranking. They were not either in the homepage, so after that campaign, they have no continuation. And actually, we examined that in terms of the growth patterns. Like, these are the 100 most popular petitions, and we can see like these most popular petitions in total, they are published in very specific days. That are typically the days that many users, because of other reasons, they go to the Cine Madrid. They are visible when there is this massive amount of users arriving the platform, and then they are able to grow very fast at the beginning, but then they stall. Actually, as you can see here, the only two ones that grow over time and reach a threshold are the ones who were in a banner, they were always visible. Actually, the third one stopped growing like them when that banner here in January, it was removed. So then the third one came here. This is the raw profiles of growth. Also, we normalize the data, and also for not having like these jumps of activity in very specific days, we took every single individual signature as the 10 dimension, and we applied that for the most popular petitions that were published in the first day of the platform. So for them, we did a clustering process, and we found two different profiles of growth. The most popular petition, the one that reads more signatures at the end, they have a constant growth. Like the ones who reached the global ranking, then they were able to grow constantly. While the ones who didn't reach a high level, and they never were among the most popular ones during that period, they grow very rapidly at the beginning, but then they get stuck. So after examining this result, we discussed with the owners of the Cine Madrid, with the development team, what it was happening, and what we found after seeing these results is like, since they were using this adaptation of the hot score, this was very similar to force petitions to grow daily in an exponential manner to remain in the homepage. And this is a good idea. We discussed about decision, we thought it was a good idea for Reddit because Reddit is about news. So news after 1, 2, 3 days, they stop being news, so that's why they are expected to drop from the homepage. But here is another paradigm. This is about petitions. So as we saw before, they need weeks, even months, to reach attention, to gain attention, to reach that threshold. So after the discussion, a new criterion was implemented in December 2018. So instead of focusing on the petitions that they were recent, that they were hot, but mostly they were recent, try to focus on the ones that are receiving recent attention. So the petition that in the last interval, and they said 30 days, are receiving more signatures, and also correcting them by how old they were. So if there were petitions that they were younger than 30 days, they had this correction factor to compete with the old ones. But still, it's not so relevant how old you are here, but how effective are you in gaining recent attractiveness. So that intervention was done, and then we measured the effect. We measured the effect days before and after the intervention, and what we found is like for the popular petitions, the ones that were in the top page, in the first page of the most popular ones, for the 100 daily most voted petitions, it was very similar, like around 20. But we see this decrease for the recent ones, for the other ones. So by deploying this new ranking, we see like now how recent petitions are less benefit, and there are some other kind of petition that get much more attention. And for doing this comparison, we matched petitions, so we apply propensity score matching for doing like matches of petitions after and before the intervention that they were about this with two coverage, talking about the same topic, and also that had a similar number of petitions on the first day. So what we can see here is like for petitions that get more than 25 signatures, and precisely more than 50 signatures on the first day, now they grow much higher than they used to do in the past. And these are also petitions that they didn't reach the ranking of the most popular ones. So it means that although these petitions, in both cases, before and after, they didn't reach the most popular ones, since now the growth in the recent days is becoming a feature for ranking those petitions, they can grow in a much more constant pattern. So this is the effect we obtained by doing that intervention. And finally, as I said, in this dissertation, we examined the detection of events that affect deliberation. We found the key role of conversation trading for reciprocity, for deliberation, and we also found how sensitive petition platforms are for changing the design of home pages and so on. So this last study, and it's a study that was published in the Social Informatics Conference in 2017, is about how to introduce discussions effectively in a platforms for only petitions. So this is we found this was a relevant challenge, since although there was much research on online petition platforms, only few were focused on the discussion dynamics in this kind of civic technologies. And the few studies, they found little or null success of these forums. Like there was a study in 2015 about platforms for municipalities of the United Kingdom in Bristol and Kingston, and they found that users, they didn't identify that they had the chance to add comments, and actually just few users published comments in those petitions. And also this comparative study by Linder and colleagues about platforms from cities in Germany, Scotland, and Norway, and they also found like the forums of discussion, the forums of petitions were badly used. So for this, we focus in the third case study, which is the city in Barcelona. The city in Barcelona is a platform that was launched in 2016 in Barcelona, initially for a process of crowdsourcing in a strategic urban plan. Now there are other processes in the platform, but at that moment it was only for that process. And for that process, cities, the idea was like use a model of online petitions. So there was an initial dump of petitions from the City Council of Barcelona, but for 2 months and a half, citizens and civic organizations, they were able to post their own petitions, to sign them, but also to discuss them. So we collected the dataset with all the petitions on all the comments during that period for that process. The idea was the motivation for focusing here, it was the novelty of the platform design. Like for this interface to be implemented, there was a previous review of different petition platforms and their discussion dynamics. So for the e-petition from the UK, there was no forum, but for your priorities in Iceland and for Open Irekia in the Basque Country, there was a strategy of having two different columns of pros and contras. So any user was able to make a petition, to sign it, but also to add comments, separate comments, whether it was a supporting or an opposing argument. And they were able to be voted, so they were like a ranking of the pros and contras for facilitate decision making. In contrast, another strategy in the City of Madrid, the one I presented before, they were using conversation threading, as done in Meneame. So the novelty of the city in Barcelona was to do an hybrid model, to combine both of them. So apply conversation threading as a forum, as Meneame, but at the same time allow users to align their first level comments. So every time a user was adding a reply to the petition, they were able to decide whether it was positive, so it was a supporting argument, a declared supporting argument, negative, an opposing argument, or otherwise it was neutral. And here we can see perfectly like how conversation threading is applied with this hierarchical interface, but also using columns, like these are pros and these are contras for this petition about setting an energy company by the city council. So the interest here, it was like we cannot only focus on the structure of the thread, but also on the reactions of different comments. Like we can examine whether discussion cascades differs among positive comments, negative comments, and neutral comments. So we examined the data, and what we found is like only a few small fraction of comments were negative, around the 5%, but these are the ones, the negative ones, that originated the larger cascades. Like negative comments, they were able to trigger larger cascades with the distribution that typically the positive and the neutral. And when we examine not only the size but also the structure of the discussion cascade, like when this is the probability, the probability given the value of the size of the cascade of a metric, the width, the depth, and the H index for deliberation of deliberative structures. What we found is like when there is no cascade, it's very likely to be either positive or neutral. When there is a cascade, it's a much higher probability of being originated by a negative one. This has some limitations, this observation, particularly we identified two limitations. The first of them is like some neutral comments, they were not truly neutral. Like we examined the content of some comments and they were marked by authors as neutral, but they were actually supporting or opposing the idea. So it might be related to many causes. One of them should be problems with the user experience, like they didn't identify that they weren't able to set it as positive or negative, or maybe there was some kind of bias through the kind of user who were participating. But obviously for the neutral there was that conflict, that some neutral were not truly neutral. And also there is another limitation, there is a class imbalance, so there are much more positive comments, 5,000, than negative comments, less than 1,000. So what we did is apply bootstrapping, so we did thousands of evaluation on random 10,000 positive and 10,000 negative comments with the replacement. And what we found is like if there was no cascade, there was a similar probability, but as soon the cascade started to have like a large size and a large width, depth, or H index, the probability is so much higher from the negative ones. So the negative ones were more likely to originate sizes of larger size and more complex structure. So this was the last case study, and I think now it's time to conclude with what we have found, the conclusions from this PhD. So this is the summary of findings. Like the first research question focused on whether it was possible to detect events that affected deliberation in online discussions. So we proposed a novel methodology. It's novel, but based in very well-known techniques like regression discontinuity design and metrics for network science that help us to see the adoption of conversation threading affected deliberative structures of discussion threads of Meneame. And also, since we applied the technique in another dimension, like the depth of the discussion, we were able to find an event that was unknown a priori. And we observed that it affected the levels of argumentation, since now the visual depth was increased by the owner of the platform. Also, conversation threading, we went in the second residential question, we wanted to focus whether it affects reciprocity, and we found that although reciprocity was increasing over time in Meneame, there was an additional boost when conversation threading was adopted. And at some extent, reciprocity is a positive indicator for online communities. There might be some controversy until which level these long chains are of value or relevance for a community, but from a general perspective, reciprocity is taken as a positive indicator. Then we wanted to check whether reciprocity was useful to model the structure of growth and discussion threads, and what we found is the extended version of the model that added reciprocity. We are better reproducing the deep structures of discussion threads, so we better characterize the dynamics of online discussion. Like we better understand the governance mechanisms of discussions online. Finally, in the part of the discussions, we examine how conversational threading affected different features of behavior, and we found like with conversation threading, like more reciprocal behavior as presented before, but also popular comments are more attractive, and all comments, their decay slowed down. And this must be discussed because it was not only conversation threading, but also the way conversation threading was applied. At that time, like branches were fully expanded and sorted by date. So the comments that belong to the first branch, first sub-branch, etc., were always in the top. So new comments who were being added to the discussion, they were less visible than before, and that might explain this result. And this is relevant because for a forum that might affect discussions, and that this is relevant, but for a civic technology for democratic participation, like if new comments that are not connected with previous arguments, like innovative comments, or they are not visible, they might affect like much more diverse views inside of the discussion. And I think this is relevant for the design of civic technologies. In terms of petition platforms, we wanted to examine which feature might difficult their growth, and we found that in the case of the CIE Madrid, a ranking inspired by the dynamic was far from adequate for favoring a constant growth, and the new ranking that was motivated by the results of this dissertation, of the exploration, the first exploration in the dissertation, facilitate that now petitions that are proving effectiveness in getting signatures, they are growing in a more constant way than they used in the past because of the Reddit-inspired ranking. And finally, we wanted to examine whether what was the best strategy to introduce discussions in online petition platforms, and we found that the approach of the Civic personnel was of interest. Like few comments were negative, but these were the ones that really originate large discussions. So this is relevant because it has some consistency with the basis of cognitive dissonance. So it's a design that favors people to see opposing point of views, and it has some political value according to the aims of the development team of this platform, of the Civic Barcelona. These are the conclusions, but also there are some limitations. All the slides I presented here, they were ignoring content. So they were language-independent approaches. This has the benefit that it's very easy to replicate these techniques in any other context. But at the same time, some social and political dimensions, like deliberation, like reciprocity, they are also expressed by text features. So it would be of relevance to add content-based features in these methodologies. Also, some methods in this work, like generative models of discussion threads, they were based on the individual preferences of users. But the way we participate online is not only determined by our own preferences, but also by the preferences to the group we belong to. So it might be of relevance to extend these techniques for modeling group behavior, to truly understand the dynamics of groups in discussions. The third limitation I presented here is like I have focused in features like conversation threading or like rankings that they help to structure or to sort information in civic technologies. But civic technologies are aimed at scaling up citizen participation. So when there is overloaded information, these techniques, they do not solve that problem. So it might be of relevant or some works on mitigating information overload, like summarization or clustering techniques. In the appendices of the dissertation, there are some prototypes in that direction. And I think this is a real open research challenge, because if we are developing tools for massive participation, like tools should also be available to provide an understanding of all these large data set of messages and petitions. I've been focused in this work with different platforms like María, and particularly the City of Madrid and the City of Barcelona. And these are, the three of them are libre open source technologies, but in the case of the City, the one of the City of Barcelona and Consul for the City of Madrid, the scope of these technologies goes beyond these two cities, like New York City, Mexico City, Paris, Helsinki, Lima are using these technologies for the governance and for participatory process. So any contribution in that direction might help not only for the cities of Madrid or Barcelona, but for the governance of cities around the world. And I will find this impact is of reference. And the final remark of this dissertation is like, as I presented before, and as introduced before, we have been working with open source platforms. And open source platforms, they allow citizens to audit how technology works. But only by examining the code, we cannot understand what are the best practices, the best algorithms, the best design for citizen participation. That requires research, like exhaustive process of research as done in this dissertation. But in this dissertation, in this work, we were limited by a constraint. It was ethically inappropriate to do experimentation with instances that were in production, where real citizens were co-producing public policies. But at the same time, any platform that we use daily on the internet, like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, they are the result of massive batteries of experimentation. And some of them in a very authoritarian way. Like we can remember the problem with Facebook with the emotional contagion experiment. So between authoritarian experimentation as done by companies in Silicon Valley, and between the absence of experimentation and just focus on limited observational studies, as presented here, I propose some other scenarios, like if it's not ethically, controversial to experiment with the platforms in production, there are spaces, and this is the Laboratory of Democratic Innovation in Barcelona, where I collaborate for the CDIM, and also Medalapra de Madrid, that they were spaces for citizen science and research around these platforms. So the idea would be to have instances in pre-production where citizens, they were able, we as citizens, to experiment with these artifacts, these technologies, which are the artifacts for new models of democracy, to learn which are the best techniques, the best designs, the best algorithms for a specific purpose, and when those experiments are validated in a rigorous manner, we can translate the results to the production system. So, of course, authoritarian experimentations must not be allowed in this context, but the absence of controlled experimentation, I think, is neither an approach to gain wisdom and gain knowledge from setting these kind of technologies for democracy. In terms of contribution, I presented in the slides, but this work has 3 journals papers, 2 already published, 1 is under review, and also 5 conference articles. One of the journal articles, it was a survey of these techniques, generative models of discussion threads, so we were giving tutorials in ACWSM this year in Munich, but also in ASONAM last year here in Barcelona. And also, papers are not the only artifact of research, like also we released the datasets we have been using, like the datasets of threads from Maeztu, from petitions from Abba.org. In the case of the CDIM and the CD was not necessary because it was open data. And also the extended version of the R package for generative models of discussion threads. This was released, and also some tools that appear in the appendices for data visualization. Like the visualization of threads was done with one of these tools, so they are released under open source licenses. So I would like to thank my collaborators and co-authors during this dissertation for all the contribution and all the knowledge they have provided to this work, but also to the academic ones, but to the non-academic ones. Like much of the wisdom and the knowledge of this research, of this project, emerged from communities like Medalapra de Madrid, and particularly the decision team and the meta-decision committee here in Barcelona, that they provided hypotheses, ideas, approaches, and their key motivation for inspiring this work, but also to contribute them back in a way to do research. So thank you very much for your attention, and please.
Okay, so thank you so much to the doctoral candidate for his great presentation, very clear. And so now is the time for the round of questions. Well, we will make several questions or objections or critiques, or we will prize your dissertation, it depends. So first I give the word to Robert West.
Great, thank you. Feels like we are being questioned.
Yeah.
Okay, so first I'd like to start by thanking you for this great presentation and impressive work. It really shows through that you care about these things. And it's good to see that you've had some real impact with Decide Madrid, where really it shows from the data that more was possible afterwards. Actually, I'd like to start with that and ask if you could give us maybe a little bit of a making of, like behind the scenes from that project, because I imagine that it wasn't as easy as it appears after the fact in the thesis. So maybe you can reflect a bit on what that process of being involved with the project was like.
Should I answer?
Yeah. We decided that we just go back and forth, more like a dialogue.
Okay. So
reciprocity, you know.
Reciprocity. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your words. I think it's a very relevant question actually, because this is the result of a process. So what I presented here, it was the result of examining 2.5 years of data. But behind the scenes, there were many stories that must be told, and they don't appear in the manuscript, but although this is being recorded, I can share it publicly. And it's like, I didn't mention in my presentation, but it appears in the manuscript. Like the idea of taking Reddit as the criteria for the hot score, it has some background. Like originally, when the City of Madrid was deployed, the 9th of September of 2015, it has no petition. For the first week, it had only debates. So what they found is like they were sorting debates by the number of upvotes. They have upvotes and downvotes because debates were able to have negative votes. And they created a preferential attachment process. Like the first debates, they got a lot of a large fraction of votes, a large amount of votes, and they got in the first place, and new debates were not being visible. So that's why they felt that they need a new ranking. So the people who were in charge of that process, they had some previous experience by using Reddit for political participation. In particular, they said the Reddit channel called Plaza Podemos, which was the forum of a political party, a major political party in Spain. And it was a successive experiment at that time. Like thousands of citizens, they were daily participating in Plaza Podemos, and it was a success, so they felt that it was a good idea to copy that strategy. What they didn't realize at that moment, it was like, it helped in that case for Reddit again, because it was for discussions. So discussions, they made no sense to keep visibility of the discussions after 3-4 days, except for the ones who were still receiving notifications. But it was quite inappropriate in the case of the petitions. So what I presented here is the result. The first exploration is the result of 2.5 years of examining that data. But the Cide Madrid, that criteria of using the hot score was set the 15th of September 2015. There was a group in Medellín Prado, and I was part of that group, but in October, in the first month, we were already saying that that was a horrible strategy, like petitions were not going to grow. And it took 2 years to convince them. And actually, it took like to have like I made this work with a lot of data and asked them to have this presentation Medellín Prado present that, okay, there are many voices who have claimed that this criteria is far from optimal, but now here we have like some empirical validation. And it still took some months, and also to make like an official complaint in the conference of this technology, which is called Consulcon, and to explain that that technique was not working, to motivate them to take that decision, that intervention. So I think this is relevant, because one thing that I have not focused on my dissertation, because it doesn't belong purely to computer science, is the governance of these techniques. So at some point, this work and these ideas help to audit how platforms operate. But then someone has to take the decision on whether these ideas should be considered and how to implement them. So the governance is a real matter, and since they are aimed at being democratic, like the way to take this decision when there is some empirical validation is, I think, an open research challenge yet.
Thank you. I would like to, so throughout the thesis there seems to be this silent assumption that reciprocity is something good. I'd like to challenge that a bit, because if you have only these, I think it showed very nicely in these graph diagrams where it's just this one chain, where you could also say that these are just two weirdos that went off on some crazy discussion. They're just calling each other names, or I don't know what could happen there.
Yeah.
But basically it means that everyone else is excluded. It's just two people that go back and forth. What I would ideally want would be everyone being involved. Of course, that's logistically impossible, but if there are more than two people involved, that would be even more desirable, I would think. But in your metrics, that would be penalized, right? Because it wouldn't be, or at least in the reciprocity metric, if there are 3 or 4 people that really have a debate, then that would decrease the reciprocity score. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Actually, that relates on how what I also explained before about group modeling. Like, since we are here focused at an individual level, like reciprocity is also taken at an individual level. But for instance, I will find of relevance whether reciprocity also occurs in different groups, like whether different groups of opinion are being reciprocal and not considering reciprocity in terms of whether one is replying to the other, but whether someone from one point of view is replying to the other. So similar views with different, with small differences might also participate. I also feel that at some point, and that's why I said one limitation and one challenge of this work is to introduce text. Like, I think, like, per se, if users are discussing, it must have some positive connotation, but at the same time, without the content, it's unclear whether the end of the chain is really providing information to the community, and whether it's becoming so narrow, the topic of the discussion, and new value is not being added, so only these 2 people are interested. So that is, I think, a great challenge, like, not to focus on reciprocity, but also to focus on a way that new comments and new ideas can be more inclusive for the community.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have some more time. Okay, so you started from you started and concluded with the observation that experimentation is unethical in this domain. So first part of this question is, let's go a bit deeper there, and what exactly are the factors that make this unethical? I wouldn't just blanket say this, because right, we do experimentation in politics all the time. We decide that, oh, maybe we should give an unconditional base salary to everyone. We don't yet, but we might at some point. It's kind of an experiment, just everyone is included in it, right? So what's really so different in having things scientific at an even deeper level? So that's the first part. And then your way out was to say, okay, we need to do observational studies. And then you several times referred to the setups that you have as natural experiments. But a natural experiment is a very specific kind of observational study where it's nearly like an experiment, where some people happen to be included in the treatment and some not, but the assignment was really haphazard. It didn't depend on properties of the people. But what you have here, for example, in the Decide Madrid study was really, you had different periods, right? You first had condition A, then everything switched over to condition B, and there was even this embargo period of 365 days. So by design, the 2 periods are far apart from each other. So I'd like you to reflect a bit on how big of a threat is this to your methodology, and how close do you get to a natural experiment? So the first part was about experimentation, and the second part about observation studies.
Okay, those are very good questions as well. I wouldn't say that doing experimentation in this domain is unethical, but I prefer to say that's ethically controversial. That I don't know if it should be allowed, it should be forbidden, but there is some controversy on it from an ethical point of view, particularly given the sensibility of this domain. So the approach in the manuscript was to present like, this is a constraint from the side of the researcher. Like, for sure we are giving experimentation. Almost these platforms, although they are not aiming at doing interventions for receiving knowledge, they are doing interventions for trying to improve the platform. So at some point, well, of course they're doing interventions. But this reflection emerged from the side of the researcher. Like as a researcher, to introduce this experimentation without like a full ethical process that was going to guarantee that participants were going to be aware of being part of a controlled experiment, and at the same time guarantee that that was not going to affect the quality of the results. And there is a study, like for example this year, this study by Majors and colleagues, that they explain how A/B testing also creates the A/B test effect. Like when participants are aware that they are the result of an experiment, the results are conditioned by that. So it's, I wouldn't say it's unethically, but it was not able to be accepted to condition the way people in Madrid and Barcelona were going to participate for a research process, although research was for the good, but it was controversial. So I agree, it shouldn't be so categorical to say that it's unethically, but there is some controversiality. In the second comment you mentioned about the natural experiments, I agree, like originally the idea of natural experiments conceptually is like having by natural chance, like the possibility of having a similar situation to a random control experiment, where some subjects are assigned to the control group and some other to the treatment. So here what we use for setting these control and treatment groups was a temporal dimension, but I agree that there might be some conditions that, because some occur before and after different periods, there might be some, we cannot neglect the limitation that some event might also originate some confounding variable. In the case of Meneame, for instance, like that intervention was given in isolation, so that's why we're trying to check before and after, because there were not other interventions occurring. But precisely in the case you mentioned about Meneame, we went one step beyond, and we not only consider time as the temporal dimension for the intervention, but also we tried to control petitions which were similar. So we tried to control the petitions that were about the same topic, petitions that had the original number of signatures in the first day, and also petitions that emerged in very specific periods that with higher levels of activity. So we try to control that, although they occur in different moments, those moments, according to the propensity score, was comparable.
Could you comment a bit on potential platform drift? Because it seems that, if I think back about the Meneame study, all the metrics changed, right? There was a shift, like a discontinuity at the intervention, but if there was a continuous drift throughout. So if we go now to the Cide Madrid study, do you think, I'd like you to muse a bit on how big is the danger of the effects just being explained by a global drift in platform conventions and so on. I really appreciate that you controlled for those two variables, the topic and the signatures on the first day, but there might be other things that change as well, right? So how can you, how sure can you be that those two variables are enough?
Okay, that's a very good question. Actually, well, they could exist. I see we cannot neglect the possibility of some other effects happening. One thing that we found of relevance is one of the initial approximation to this work was to focus not, like traditionally most of the works on petition platforms, they focus on features from the petitions. So the original idea was to focus on features from the platform, but also features from the community. So try to see, like, petitions are not popular, they are not successful because of having a great idea or being also by a relevant person, but also by the platform favoring them, as some here, but also by the community. So there might be some community supporting their growth, and that might explain. And for that, we collect, and there's some studies that have proved that. There is a study by Proskurnia with some colleagues, Carlos Castillo and Calabre, that in that they presented a predictive model of petitions. But there is something very relevant in the Cide Madrid that's different from other petition platforms. It's like only verified signers, verified users can sign for the petition, only residents of Madrid. So what we try to use as a proxy of the community support was data from Twitter, from social media, trying to see like whether like the time series of tweets about, containing links to the petitions might help to predict the arrival of signatures. And what we found is there was not a correlation in that way as found in the other one. And that might be related to that, because although the internet is a global population, the only users who can do that action of sending a petition are a very minor minority of the internet population, without the residents of Madrid. And also not only the residents of Madrid, the residents of Madrid who own a verified account in the city of Madrid. So all these out of the platform events that might affect the platform, they might be not so relevant. Actually, what we found is like platform events, like things happening within the platform, were much more relevant than the communities mobilizing for signature. So some way that gives us some level of confidence that platform features that might play a much more relevant role than the external ones. And actually recently, I think it was at the beginning of the year, in January, there was a similar work of petitions in the UK, and it was done by people, I think, from the Oxford Internet Institute. And what they found, they compared like petitions in the UK platforms and the debates of those petitions in Twitter. And they found a similar thing, like there were some petitions that were very popular with no debate, some popular with debate, and so on. There was not a strong relationship between that. And that's the similar case. Only verified users were able to sign. So that's why the internal dynamics of the platforms, they might play a major role rather than external events that they play some role, as we saw here, like if there is a campaign, like this happening here, it might have an effect, but then it doesn't feel affected the growth over time.
If you want to be a bit more formal about ruling out other confounds, then you could look into sensitivity analysis, for example, where the idea would be, yes, maybe the variables that I'm accounting for are not all the ones I need, but in order for there still to be a difference, basically the two would have to vary so dramatically in their propensity that it's just beyond common sense, or sometimes you can even drive it ad absurdum. So then if you do an analysis like that, then you could make it more formal why these could be enough. Do I have time for one more question?
Well, but very fast.
Okay, fast question. So the one result that you had was that threading is good, right? Did I hear that correctly?
There are some indicators that they have a positive connotation, but there are some results like these ones, like popular comments becomes more popular, on all comments retain much more attention, that there is an increase in terms of the attractiveness of the popular ones or the old ones, but per se it doesn't have a positive value. Actually, I feel it's not positive for the growth of the discussions.
I see. Because my comment would have been one very popular platform that actually was a pioneer in abolishing threading was Gmail. And it works really well, right? So my question would have been if threading is, if these people switch towards threading, why did Gmail go away from it? And is there a fundamental difference between Gmail and Meaname?
Well, I think they belong to different type of platforms. I think, although both are asynchronous, mail discussions, people might be involved, but in many situations they are focused on two individual people exchanging ideas, or just informing in one way back. But I think in an online discussion, it's a place where communities should express their ideas. And I feel that in that case, it's different because you not only want to see like a linear sequence of events, like in an email, like how people acknowledge with the initial idea, or how they confirm the attendance to an event, and so on. While here in an online forum, I think conversation threading helped to structure like the different topic and the subtopics emerging for the initial post. Actually, this department has been very useful in proving that. Like some weeks ago, there was a mail thread in this department about a conflict about some decision taken by Universitat Pompeu Fabra because of the Catalan process and the sentence of the Spanish court. And there was a discussion thread that took like 100 comments or something like that. And there are many different opinions about the quality and the quantity of these messages, but there was an overall discussion. Like it was not easy to follow the entire strings of arguments, and I feel that was related for using Gmail, because the mail of Pompeu Fabra belongs to the Gmail ecosystem, instead of using a pure forum when we can see like how the different opinions and different subtopics are. So I think it was a perfect example.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you, Pablo. Madam President, I officially turn off my microphone.
Okay, thank you so much, Robert. So now it's time of Josep Perelló.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to focus on 3 different issues. Well, first of all, thank you. So it was a very nice presentation, and also thanks. And I feel honored to be here to the supervisors, because I think that you did a fantastic work also. So the 3 main themes is going to be about something that has already been raised, that this quite strong statement on citizen experimentation for democracy. Okay, so the second one will be about the statistical analysis, and finally on modeling, I would like to ask you several things. So starting by the first one, and from there, because also it can be a continuity about the discussion that it was already been raised. First of all, what I would like also to know more is who is really there. So who is behind these platforms, no? And also this is also related to about the big questions, no? That you are studying interventions, yes, no? And also that also my colleague already asked for, is that what is the improvement then, no? And what are the goals for improving what exactly, no? So if it is about improving participation, diversity, success, efficiency in the platform, so this is one thing that I would like you to discuss a little bit further. And the second thing is about the same idea of non-invasive approach. No? So I fully support your approach. As you can imagine, I'm coming from physics, and there are many colleagues working using some things that for me are not, I'm not in favor, just against. But at the same time, when you're discussing about this concept of citizen experimentation, I would think that we don't need, or maybe it could be also controversial to work on A/B testing as well. First of all, because the conditions might also change, and you have a time series in the end. So you are splitting some periods, no? And can be them fully comparable? Can you put them there, or shall we think about other strategies that I think that especially when we are talking about citizen participation must be there, just because maybe the participants must be fully aware of what is really happening, and also because they might even themselves learn and think and propose in a much more efficient manner than just a co-design participation discussing the technology behind, no? So the platform functioning. So this is more or less what I was wanting to question and to put on the table, and ask you to add something here, and also mostly related on what could be the next challenges, and what could be the best methodologies in these terms, and which could be the new avenues, no? Even in academics, so how we can study all this, just moving forward about the observational stuff, because if we want to intervene, maybe we shall intervene in the very first step then, no?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your words. Well, the first question is who is behind this kind of platform. Like, there is a strong bias in the kind of profile behind these platforms. They are mostly male, well-educated. There is a majority of people who are holding a PhD, so it's obviously a very strong bias of very insane people taking decisions. But I think this is one of the motivations of doing this kind of audit efforts. Since the code here is going to reflect the inspiration and the motivation of the people who are taking this decision, it might be affected by the final design. This is a perfect example. I didn't include in the manuscript, but in the city in Barcelona, I focused on the discussion, but not in the signing group. So in the city in Barcelona, it was, since it started before the city of Madrid, it was shown at the very early beginning that decision of the whole score was far from optimal. So there was a large discussion in the GitHub repository, and I also participated there, providing some exploratory analysis I did at the time. And what it was fun is like there was not a clear indication of what was the best idea of how to sort these petitions in the CDM. So the final decision was like, since the final person who took the responsibility is a philosopher, he took the possibility and very inspired by political motivations, he felt that, okay, since we don't have a clear indication of which kind of bias are we able to assume politically, let's do it randomly. So, and for the until now, in every instance of the CDM, they are by default sorted randomly. So not giving any specific preference to any specific petition. That it's true that maybe it's the less biased approach, but also from the part of user experience is the most horrible experience that many participants will suffer, because it's very hard to find things of relevance until you start to make several clicks. So I think this is one of the ways of how to improve that. Like I think there is a need for empirical research to show that there is not only there should not only exist an awareness that decisions are going to constrain the way, but also having some empirical validation of which are going to be the specific conclusions of those interventions. So, for instance, now there are going to be like a similar process in the CDM as the one I presented here in this manuscript, and there was a discussion over the last weeks on how to set a group of researchers, activists, designers who discuss the implications, and they asked me to include some of these ideas and get some results, get the results to reflect on which are the best design. Actually, the conference of the CDM was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and there was a panel about research. Dr. Borge, she was there also presented her work on the discussion dynamics, and I think this is of relevance. Like, I think one of the main goals of this kind of approaches is how to improve the way of set clear statements of which interventions and to what extent specific interventions like the ones presented here are going to impact in one way or another. So it is true what I was very insisting in this manuscript about the controversies of A/B testing, but at the same time, in connection with what also Dr. West commented, just doing like natural experimentation by different time stamps, it will never be so reveal results as these much more controlled approaches that I'm not opposing them. So that's why I'm trying to explore, and this is what I explained in the end about the next challenges of citizen experimentation. So, since there are physical spaces for these for the teams of these technologies, and there is the Laboratorio Innovación Democrática, for instance, here in Barcelona, like actually now there is an active discussion inside of the team on how to deploy a pre-production instance. Like there are actually pre-production instances for developers, so why not a pre-production instance for researchers? So we can do research here and also introduce the scientific method into the way to take decisions. Because in the end, many of the decisions are taken by political profiles responsible for the projects, but also there are many very specific details that are not given, so an individual coder is just taking a decision, and that might influence a lot. So I think this is one of the next challenges. Like in the case of Madrid, but particularly in Barcelona, I think there has been kind of success of building a community around the awareness of that and having researchers together with non-academic profiles of programmers, policymakers, activists, designers, and so on, but not only to discuss and to compare experiences, but also to do truly experimentation. So I think that would be the next challenge.
Yeah, no, I think that it needs to be redesigned, and also I think that it opens up a new research avenue in any case, because I think, or my belief is that A/B testing is not going to be enough. We need to move forward about this paradigm, and also at the same time, because behind that also there are many tensions. So because you're investigating something through an intervention, and then when you know something, you will intervene again. So it's like a kind of loop that it asks for action at the same time that you're doing some research. So there are many things there that I think that needs to be dealt in a careful way. So so I would like also now to raise the statistical stuff. If you can just put, for instance, the slide number 16. where that's the first one that you introduced, no? The methodology, no? So personally, and maybe that's my problem, I'm not saying that is your problem at all, is that I'm not fully understanding how you proceed, okay? So first of all, I would say, and just correct me if I'm not wrong, so is that the F test is just to compare variances of different data sets or samples or whatever, no? So secondly, I know that it has been used for, especially from people from econometrics, that I'm not a good friend of them, also, I can just tell you. And in this sense, they are using this kind of regression discontinuity, no? So behind all this, there are many assumptions that I would like to have seen, okay? So, and this deals also with just to have a much more concrete flavor of what is the data, no? So since I have not touched the data, I don't know which are the main statistical properties of this data, no? But there are several assumptions like Gaussianity there, that we are assuming that also the process is linear, no? So why you choose this method? And did you try to compare this method with another methods? So can be comparable. So why you finally choose this strategy to deal with all this?
Okay, that's a very good question. Well, the reason for taking this method is like we saw like an increasing interest in academic field of trying of causal inference and trying to approach these kind of interventions and interventions that are given, that are not determined by the researchers, and there was like a popularity of using these kind of techniques. Also, we evaluate different kinds of higher level orders of the polynomial, but we found like as presented in the data, in both cases in reciprocity and its index, we see like
it wasn't necessary.
Linear field.
Okay.
And what we decided just to adapt in this case is like mostly the statistic. Originally in the Lee and Linux handbook, what they propose is like to use that technique for setting the bin width of the data, like how you collect the data. So we did that, but after we thought like trying to do it in the opposite way, like instead of giving intervention, trying to determine what is the bin width, trying to do it in the opposite way, like having the bin width, how to set like which is the moment that is more the higher F statistic value to express where an intervention might have occurred. Okay,
so just sorry. So when you're calculating the F test, what you're doing is you're calculating this number every day?
In every week.
In every week.
In every week.
And you are taking which kind of data you are really taking there? So you're taking the before intervention, or it's like a kind of, you take every week, you calculate this number, and you just make a window shift?
Exactly. We take the value, or in this case, it's the H index, so it's the average H index of the discussions of every week. Every dot belongs to every week.
And when you're running the F statistic, which it is comparing and it is taking two different variances.
Yeah.
Which of these variances you are using then?
Yeah,
so
I'm using from I'm comparing the continuous regression with the discontinuous regression.
Okay, so you are just taking the whole sample, no?
Yeah.
Okay, so just assuming that everything is like it's the same sample, no? So it's the same time series, and the other case is just to doing like the. Okay. Okay. I understand.
Because one thing that we found controversial from the studies is like they were assuming that since the intervention was poorly given and there was some specific work about detecting platform effects in online platforms by Malik and Jorfer, they were aware of the intervention, so they just measured it. But for sure, what we found is like any different kind of discontinuity was always going to benefit data like continuous data. So we needed to get like a much stronger awareness of an intervention rather than knowing that the intervention occurred, but trying to see like whether from an empirical point of view there was some statistical value that was much higher than a specific time stamp.
Oh, yeah, because when you're calculating the F test in this context, is because you see a difference, no? So you detect a kind of transition there, no? So the greater is the worst, let's say, no? The adjustment, no? So the F test, when you get a peak, is because there is something really wrong there, right? That's no, okay. Okay, thank you. And in these terms also, I would like to finish, and I will just make a final question, if you allow me. is to talk about the modeling strategy. Okay, so in terms of the modeling strategy, at a given moment you are using two different terms, no? Like the generative models, no, and the predictive models, no. I'm not fully sure about what you mean by predictive models, honestly, and in this sense, so also I think that that in that sense, also when you're trying to deal with this kind of modeling, you are just analyzing, let's say, if I improve a specific model that was in the literature, no, and you add an additional element, no, so you see how the situation or the description improves, no, right? So have you also indeed studied or compared with other models? So I mean, like, in some way or another, if you add more complexity in a model, generally it fits better, right? You add an additional variable, so in general it would fit better, no? So in some ways, sometimes it's not fair to do that, no? Because you are just from a simple model and you are just putting a more complicated model, so always the complicated model would fit better, no? In technical terms. So I don't know if you can discuss a little bit about this and why using this kind of models as well, no?
Okay, that's a very good question. We did a survey on generative models that at the beginning focused on the 5 existing models, then there were 2 other models in the final journal version, which is the model we developed, and also a model done by a colleague, Alberto Lumbreras, and his colleagues. So the difference between generative and predictive, here in this table we have 5 generative models, but actually the one by Backstrom is predictive. And it's predictive in terms like it helps to predict the final length of a discussion it was in Facebook, in Google Plus, and Wikipedia. So the idea is like taking different features from the data, like the novelty, the arrival patterns, text expression, and some things related to social influence, how to be able, by getting like the initial messages of a discussion, to predict the final length. So it just has, they don't want to explain the structure the structure and growth of the discussion, but only having to have a prediction of the final picture of the discussion. And this is what is done in Backstrom. Also, maybe motivated because in some discussions like Facebook, they are not threaded, so there was only an interest on setting the length. Well, when we are talking about here generative models, they are not just only motivated for having to predict what is going to be the end of the discussion in an accurate way, but also to identify what are the mechanisms and in which way they affect the structure and growth of discussion thread. And they are called generative because when we estimate the value of the parameters related to the different features, then we are able to generate synthetic data. So it's what is done here, right? We have real online discussions, so we estimate the statistical significance of the corresponding features. With the model, we learn, in this case, in the case of the Gomez and colleagues, which is the specific value for many for alpha, beta, tau, and in the standard model was kappa, and then we can reproduce, we can generate new discussion threads. So we can generate synthetic data, and finally we can validate whether the structural properties, the size, the depth, or the width are comparable. So we are not only trying to predict, like trying to have a purely data-driven approach, but also motivated by an understanding approach, like trying to understand why, to what extent these features of behavior might be relating to them. The second question, it was about, okay, with the Occam ratio, like of course adding like the less number of parameters, like better fits the model, and the more parameters going to better explain, but until what extent we are adding complexity to that. In this case, the motivation of adding a specific parameter was clear because of, at that moment there exist these 3 existing models, Gomez and Kumar, for doing so. So the one of Gomez and colleagues, what we found is like, actually it was already used in Meneame, but it was very unsuccessful on trying to reproduce the depth of the discussion. It was very good fitting the distribution of sizes, distribution of degrees, but not of the depth. And at the same time, we found, like, since by exploring the data, reciprocity seems to be associated with the deep structures, the other model of Kumar, it included reciprocity, but they did reciprocity in another way around. Like, the model of Kumar is very similar to the one of Gomez, since it has popularity and novelty, not the root variance. So they are using the preferential attachment process and the novelty to reproduce the structure of the cascades, the discussion cascades. And after the cascade is over, they use reciprocity to set the authors of every comment, and it fits, and it helps also to do so. But they were not fitting well the depth distribution, and also the reciprocal, reciprocal behavior was not part of the model. It was also something that was set after the structure was generated. So in some way we found like this was not the proper way to truly understand the discussions. Like, of course, adding this extra parameter was going to add one layer of complexity, but at the same time was going to help us to truly validate by doing this approach whether it's faster like this, whether what we are observing by exploring the data, like they are deep structure, but these structures are very peculiar because of reciprocal behavior. So trying to validate with a formal modeling whether it's because of reciprocity, and apparently, according to the assessment of the model that appear here, is much better fitted. So we add that layer of complexity, but at the same time, I think we provide a better understanding why online discussions, many times, and is expressed in a very informal way, here are so deep. Many times, like, users start to engage to interested in having the last word. So I did that course of adding that extra feature. I think it really helped to provide an understanding.
Okay, so thank you very much for your answers, and I would like again to thank you for this great work, and very brave and very multidisciplinary. And I know that that's not easy in academia right now.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. So first of all, thank you to the doctoral candidate and to his supervisors also, because I think that this thesis is very innovative and also is a very excellent thesis from a theoretical point of view, but also from a methodological point of view. And I feel also very honored of being a member of this thesis committee, because I'm a political scientist and not a computer scientist or a mathematician. So in that sense, well, I appreciate that. So I will make some comments in detail on the theoretical framework, also on the innovative aspects of the dissertation, and finally on methodology and bibliography. I'm following the report, so I will read the report. So, okay, so first of all, regarding the theoretical framework, as I said, I think that is excellent because the candidate combines the literature and models from computational social science and machine learning, but always with a focus on how to foster citizen participation and deliberation. That's, I think, that is the main aim of the dissertation. Although it's clearly a computer science thesis, the concerns, the problems addressed, for example, how to increase the engagement of citizens in online petitions, how to preserve equal chances of success for all the citizen proposals, how to create a model to assess online deliberation. I think that these concerns and problems belong to the political science realm as well. So, in fact, the candidate demonstrates a good knowledge of the political science literature on e-government, on e-petitioning, on online deliberation. And I think that in that sense, it's a very good example, as Dr. Pello said, of an interdisciplinary thesis, of a multidisciplinary thesis. So, having said that, I found basically two problems in the theoretical framework that I will kindly ask the candidate to discuss about. So the first is the classification on page 15 of the 3 civic technologies in that e-participation letter. I think that this, well, the location that you did, the placement that you did of the 3 civic technologies is not sufficiently explained. and their assignation to the top level is too simplistic. In addition, these types of participation ladders that you explained very well are inspired by Sherry Arnstein. They have been very criticized for being unidimensional and very normative, since they only take into account the extent to which citizens hold power in the participatory processes. So there are better and knowledge classifications, among them the one formulated by Aragón, that is one of the most influential experts on democratic governance. This is a suggestion that maybe you can improve this part for future research, for future publications. His classification combines 3 dimensions. The one that you explained in this chapter, that is how discussions are linked with policy or public action. So what is the impact of the discussions online, or the impact of the petitions online on public decisions? But the other 2 dimensions, the other dimensions that I think that are very important for classification of civic technologies is who participates, questions of plurality and inclusion, how participants communicate with one another and make decisions together. So these 2 dimensions, who participates and how participants communicate with each other and make decisions together with relation to aggregation of deliberation. Okay, so another problem for me is the concept of online petition that the candidate holds. I think that is too broad and leads, in some parts of the dissertation, to bias in the literature review and in the contextualization of the civic technologies studied. I agree that the participatory processes analyzed in the case of the CIDE Madrid are indeed online petitions. However, the participatory elaboration of the strategic city plan in Barcelona, I think that was not a petition process, because what was much more centered on offline and online discussions. There was numerous aggregation and selection of proposals by the local government, and the results were not mandatory for the local government. I think that as a result, the review of the previous studies focus only on online petition is too short, is not enough. The literature on participatory websites and platforms, especially literature on the local initiatives in Spain and Catalonia, is not taken into account. And on several pages, the candidate states that the trend towards the implementation of civic technologies for participation starts in Spain in 2015, and I don't think that's the case. I think that that's a kind of historical inaccuracy, because numerous local government participatory websites and platforms with interactive features of Web 2.0 have been developed during the last 20 years. So that I think that's one of the reasons that new platforms such as Consul or Decidim are being welcomed and easily adopted by many Spanish and Catalan municipalities. So that's the point regarding the theoretical framework. If you want to answer now, okay.
Okay, so thank you very much for your nice words. Regarding the theoretical framework, the first question was related about the participation ladder adapted in the page 15 for the second chapter. That it also only takes this dimension, the level of communication, but ignore like who's participating and how participants are able to participate. Well, one of the reasons for doing so was like since the narrative of the thesis and the framework was basic on the civic technology phenomena that is new in terms of the term, how the term is coined, but it's based on very existing practices of e-government. But since focusing at the beginning civic technologies, we were not able to find specifically with the notion of civic technologies like a proper framework. Like one of the few surveys we found about works of civic technologies by Jorge Sandíbal and colleagues, it was published this year, 2019. So when we were focused not on civic technology but in e-participation, we found like how the typical participation ladder was adapted to the electronic systems, and we found like since the main goal of the framework was to distinguish between these two kinds of paradigms of participation, like discussing and taking decisions, like the participation ladder in the final step was going to merge both of them, so it was going to provide this narrative. Of course, it's not considering some other relevant implications, and I thank for the reference, like who is participating, but at the same time, it is something that we did not focus on the manuscript, on the research, like not trying to focus on aspects like the relevance of the kind of users, like for instance, in case of the discussions of the city in Barcelona, there were not only different users, but different kind of roles. So there was the city council, there were citizen organization, but also some petitions were published by facilitators in offline meetings. So they might play some role of that. Actually, it was much harder for the ones in offline meetings to then trigger discussions online, since the discussion originally occurred offline. So they might play some role, but since we didn't take into consideration that part of the who was participating at that time, that's one of the reasons why we found this theoretical framework that is much more narrow, but it fits somehow with the case studies we're addressing in this work. The second question was related to try to set into the paradigm of online petition the experiences of the city of Madrid and the city in Barcelona. And I acknowledge that in the case of the city of Madrid, citizen proposals is very similar to the online petitioning. Not so much in the case of the city in Barcelona. Actually, in the original paper published in Social Informatic Conference, is not used the word online petitions, but the words online proposals. This was a decision not from our research side, but from the political side, because petition, it has some connotation of begging in Spain, in Spanish, so they try to avoid these kind of narratives. So we were using the original term, which is online proposal, but also during some research stay in the Oxford Internet Institute, I was recommended to try to frame with the notion of petitioning, because it was much better understandable from the existing literature. That's why the way the proposal original approach was moved into petitioning, and then try to frame both experiences in that way. But I totally agree that the process in Barcelona was much more complex in terms of how it was not purely petitioning. Actually, the number of signatures was not related to any mandatory decision to be taken. But one of the reasons that finally found convincing for doing so, it was, the recommendation from the Anglo-Saxon literature experts, and also the reason that at that time both were powered by consuls, so they were using the same model of online petitioning. So although it was not for online petitioning per se, the technology they were using, it was a technology for online petitioning. So at some point we found that we could take that assumption, but of course, to reduce the experience of the PAM process and the petitioning umbrella, I think is also to reduce the richness in terms of complexity of the political process. And finally, there was these mentions, I think originally in the introductions of the chapters related to the city in Barcelona, saying that there has been some kind of trend towards the implementation of civic technology in Spain from 2015. I try to add into that narrative, like not that there were pioneering experiences. Actually, in the case of the city in Barcelona, the way of introducing discussion, it was based on a review on existing platforms, and two of them was one, the city of Madrid, but the other was OpenIREQIA, which was a clear, perfect example of e-government in the Spanish state, and there are so many other experiences. So by doing so, it was not to try to set a clear statement that there was like a new era of civic technology in Spain emerging from that specific year, but yes, a trend since the the development of these tools that are freely open source and they are promoted by the two largest cities in Spain, Madrid and Barcelona, they have created now dozens of citizens inside of the Spanish states, and many Catalonian cities are using these specific technologies. So the initial message was not to say that it was new, it was innovative, but it was a trend. It was something that emerged at some specific moment, and it was getting popular and viral among different municipalities in the Spanish state. But it is true that there are many relevant experiences, and the one of Open Decade was one of the mentioned in chapter number 6, I think.
Thank you for the answers. So, well, I will jump some of the parts of the report, because I think this is too long. So, I will comment on methodology, okay? So, I think that the methodology that you used is also interdisciplinary, and I like it very much. And I like also the point that is of great application and social utility for the improvement of citizen engagement. There are several dimensions of the methodology that I consider very relevant. The first one is the use of real case studies and observational methods. In this way, I think that it's possible to demonstrate the impact for participation of design interventions. I think that is very useful, this methodology, because it's the real behavior of people on the platforms what is analyzed. And also the combination of computational and statistical methods. I think that they have been combined in a very innovative way to infer events that can affect user behavior and to characterize the online participation, the dynamics of the conversations also. Among the methods used, I would like to highlight the elaboration of specific generative models that can be applied to characterize deliberation on any kind of online fora or conversations. I think that the efforts of the candidate and of their supervisors help us also to help social scientists to have at our disposition an instrument with we can automatically measure key dimensions of online deliberation and use it for large conversation and for the numerous conversations that we can find on social media and online platforms. In fact, I have used that in my recent research, this kind of metrics. But I would like to discuss a little bit about these structural metrics and the age index that you have used to assess representation, argumentation, and deliberation. I think that maybe the main problem is that they do not take enough into account that very few users, we have been talking about that, Robert West and also Dr. Perio, they have explained a little bit about that, that we have to take into account users and group of users that normally, usually they monopolize the conversation, and therefore it's necessary to include in this index the number and contributions of unique users, not only the metrics on comments. And also I think that the metric of width would improve if we take into account not only the maximum number of comments at any level, but if the comments at the same level are distributed in different subthreads. It is very different if comments at the same level belong to only one subthread or are distributed in different subthreads. In any case, my concern here is to detect concentration of discourse, because normally there are few users that are controlling the conversations on participatory platforms and also on social media, and this runs against inclusion and plurality of online conversations. And regarding the bibliography, I think that is very much updated and tackles correctly the different theoretical and methodological aspects of the thesis. But still, I think that in the, as I said, in relation to the theoretical section, I think that there is a lack of previous studies and analysis of massive online participatory processes taking place in Spain and Catalonia before 2015. And I think that it's good if you also try to refer to this previous work. For example, in the case of Catalonia, the platform before the Civic was Consensus, the Consensus platform, and it has also forums online, spaces for online petitions, and most of the municipalities used that platform, and they learn a lot from that platform, and that's the point that they have adapted also the CDIM to this, to their tradition or to their way of doing, and so that's the point that the implementation of the CDIM is so different depending on the municipalities. Okay, thank you.
Okay, there were many comments. Some of them, well, thank you very much for raising comments about the structural metrics. I totally agree, structural metrics, they help to describe the dynamics of the discussions, and I believe that the approach done by González Bailón and colleagues, it provides some understanding of some level of deliberation or even controversiality in this discussion, because there is some these cascades occurring that might explain some positive values of this complexity in the discussion, but at the same time, I agree that, and that's why I try to explain as a limitation, not only the emergence of messages, but also the emergence of users participating, whether it's concentrating the participation of users, but also the discourse might be taken into consideration. And that's why I feel like trying to focus on groups of users, and at the same time try to focus with content-based features might provide some better understanding. So I totally agree on that. And at the same time, in terms of deliberation, there are coding schemes that really, I think they truly provide a much better understanding of the deliberative structures, like the one by Dennis Kiers and colleagues. The problem is they require some kind of human annotation, so we need resources for automatization of this kind of quantification of deliberation. Well, the work you presented some weeks ago using precisely data from the same person, I think will be of great value. There are not techniques. There is one approach called the leaf analysis that from some Canadian researchers, some Canadian scholars, that they are taking a precisely data set annotated with that precise scheme and applying machine learning for doing so. So I think it would be another way to not to rely in purely structural metrics. I think structural metrics, they provide some understanding, but they should be complemented by contribution of unique users and particularly discourse.
Sorry, but what I mean is to improve these structural metrics. Also, of course, I agree totally about adding this content analysis, but I'm referring to improve the H metric in the sense of kind of layers, not only referring to comments, but also referring to users. That's,
and particularly the different kind of concentration of users, and also, if it's possible, the features from users. One of the most limited aspects of these kinds of platforms, particularly in the case of the CDIM, is there were few features from the users, so it was not able to know who was participating, in terms of gender, age, range, district, and so on. So at some point, also trying to find the diversity of the discussion, how many users, but also how the social dimensions of user are distributed across the different layers of the discussion and the discourse. And finally, I agree there has been a strong focus on the recent experiences here from 2015. Also, the reason for that to happen, it was this dissertation started in 2015, and it was motivated precisely by a personal motivation, being in contact with both teams and being part of research collaborator of these two teams. So there was a lot of, there was some bias through these kind of experiences. In the case of Consensus, it was, I think, relevant, and cities here in Catalonia, for instance, Badalona, and so on, they have a large experience in using these kind of platforms. I think not only the development of this platform, but research around this platform should benefit much better from making much more explicit the connection between these previous experiences and the new that have emerged in the previous year. So I totally agree with that.
Okay. Okay. So thank you so much for the answers. And now, if someone in the audience wants to ask any question, someone that is a PhD, a doctor, can raise a question or make any comment. No, if any. Okay, so no doctor wants to make any questions. So I invite now to the supervisors of the dissertation if they want to make any comment or to explain the process of the dissertation or to talk about the candidate, etc.
So I mean, I think I told you everything that you may know by now. So maybe for the audience, thanks to everyone for staying for so long. And so I want to say that I met Pablo like more than 4 years ago, and he was, I would say, like more 80% activist, 20% with background in data science, data analytics. And after these 4 years, I think these percentages have changed. So maybe I raise the question, how much percentage of data analyst, data scientist are you now an activist?
Well, I think I have a very strong bias to give a precise number of which is the percentage of activists or academic, but I can say, it has been said that this work is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. I think this work is transdisciplinary. I know where I came from, but I feel that now I'm also connected with some kind of discipline, some kind of experiences that I was not expecting to develop. And for instance, one thing that I missed in this work was this thing of the governance. Like once I have seen like how as a computer scientist I'm able to measure and understand these interventions, now I feel that there is some need to go to a more political side to see like how is the governance model that will benefit these interventions to favor. So there has been a transition of percentage. I don't know yet. It's part of life, I guess.
Okay, yeah, so I think this was a very long journey, this PhD. It started much earlier than the day. It started when, for me at least, when we had the job interview. I don't give details about it. The people over there know it. Some time ago. It's an impressive journey, and it's for sure it ended up totally differently than we intended to. I have the illusion at least that some influence on the direction. I hope, and the output makes me very proud, and I'm very happy to be here and to have seen this today.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the interventions. So now we are going to deliberate, so I ask you to leave the room. Thank you. Okay, so the thesis committee considers that the thesis is outstanding. As we said, very good from a theoretical point of view and also from a methodological point of view, and also has important applications to enhance participation of citizens. So in that sense, all of us, we agree that the grade is excellent, and the committee also has proposed the candidate for Cum Laude, but we can't say if he got the Cum Laude or not, because that will be known on a week, I think, when the envelope will be open. Okay, so but I think that the thesis is great. So that's the point that we reach very fast to a consensus. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for your
Thank you. Should we take a picture? Gracias.
We don't have to say anything else, right?
No.
It's your turn.
Picture?
Now it's time for Pablo. Let's go.
Yeah, now we have pick upstairs in the 4th floor, okay? Until 2 more or less. Well, until 2 we'll go for lunch, but Pica Pica can continue until food is over. ¿Hacemos una foto?
Vale.
Qué mal se ve esto ahora.
Everybody's taller than me.
Uf, qué mal se ve. ¿Qué ha pasado?
Oh,
Que salga. Miembros, ¿no?
Sí, ¿no?
So should we take a picture?
That's up to you.
Yeah, sure.
You want us here? Or
Yeah, for sure.
On Twitter now.
A ver, David, ven.
Sí, ja ho vaig veure, sí. Sí, perquè he vist la teva webita.
Además las digo, Andrés y tal, para el newsletter de Universitat. Sí, claro. Los tutores.
Ay, espera, desconecto.
Es más, debería venir David también.
Sí, David.
Sí. I després és que no sé què.
Aquí. Bring him on.
De que no poden aportar res i tal. Això és una cultura també, però la paternalisme que t'has internalitzat i que fa que no t'atreveixis a...
Una. Venga, David.
Gràcies perquè també